I often open up these episodes with some sort of pithy anecdote or amusing observation, something that emerges naturally from whatever case that we happen to have under consideration. But I'm not going to do that today. Today is a bit different. There's no case we're looking at, no single discrete example of risk management gone wrong or gone right. Instead, we're looking today at something more foundational, a phenomenon that's ubiquitous to risk management and to quite literally all of human decision making. And this phenomenon is loss aversion. Now, Rich, you and I mentioned loss aversion in passing a great deal across all of the episodes that we've recorded so far, I think, and in much of our just personal conversation back and forth. But we don't really go into a lot of detail around it very often because I think, given the niche that you and I have chosen to occupy, loss aversion is kind of self-evident to us, what it is and how it manifests. But it's very, very important for the risk management space and really for any kind of decision-making space. And it's considerably more subtle and nuanced, I think, than most people realize. I would absolutely hope that anybody in the risk space has at least a cursory understanding of loss aversion, but for those who maybe are not in the risk space, or if perhaps you were not in class that day when you went over that in your intro to risk management, what is loss aversion? Formally put, we would describe loss aversion as a preference for avoiding losses rather than pursuing gains. The classical presentation of this would be that the pain of losing $100 is greater than the pleasure of acquiring $100. There's not a precise equivalence between losses and gains, or how losses and gains are perceived, I should say, the way that a lot of classical economic models and just classical decision-making models would suggest. If you look at traditional classical and even some neoclassical economic theory, actual outcomes and perceived outcomes should be perfectly linear and perfectly balanced across losses and gains. And that's not what we observe. That's not what we see when we examine human behavior. People reliably put a premium on avoiding losses and will cheerfully and willingly look past or ignore an opportunity to gain $200 so as to avoid a possibility of losing $100. Mathematically, this makes no sense. But for reasons that we'll get into, this is actually fairly predictable and reliable, and I would argue eminently understandable when we look at the context in which our decision-making tools emerged. It's important to point out a couple of things around loss aversion. One, this is not the same thing as risk aversion. Risk aversion and loss aversion are often talked about synonymously, or they are very often mixed up when people are presenting them or considering them, but they are not the same thing. They sound like they should be related, but they really aren't. Loss aversion, as we said, is this tendency to say, I would rather put myself in a position where I don't experience a loss rather than go after a gain of equal or potentially even larger magnitude. Whereas risk aversion is a preference for certain outcomes. It is a preference for avoidance of uncertainty, avoidance of ambiguity, and avoidance of prospects where you do not have full knowledge about what is likely or unlikely to happen. Risk aversion and loss aversion can actually have different relationships depending on whether or not you are in the gain domain or a loss domain with an outcome. And so the upshot of all of this is please do not think of these as the same thing. They're not. We may talk about risk aversion today, but the focus of our conversation for this episode is loss aversion. And the reason for this is because it pops up everywhere in risk management. The other thing that I think is really important to point out is that losses don't have to be material for loss aversion to apply. When somebody is in the risk space or the finance space, it's really easy to think about all outcomes as dollars moving either net positive or net negative on a balance sheet. But loss aversion applies in far more domains than just that. It absolutely applies in things such as social status. It applies in things such as self-concept or identity. It applies in things such as emotional state. Any sort of loss or gain that we may experience is susceptible to potentially skewed interpretation and processing by loss aversion.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to get to, John, was the prospect theory curve and the loss domain, and that what you have done is compare a loss versus a gain of equivalent amount. I think another place where sometimes, students and even practitioners like myself get a little bit confused is thinking about things in the loss domain with regards to prospect theory when prospect theory is first introduced. So, one of the places where I think also there can be confusion is in what I like to refer to as the casino effect, which is where there is a tendency, again, it's been repeated several times, originally by Kahneman and Tversky and by other researchers, that when dealing with uncertainty in the loss domain exclusively, that individuals prefer to risk taking a larger loss versus the possibility of a smaller but certain loss. That is not loss aversion in the way that we are describing it here. And it's fueled by loss aversion, but it is a subtle, nuanced difference from what we're actually going to talk about today.
I think it's worth pointing out just for people who may wish to pursue their own investigations. What you just described is often called the reflection effect. The fact that choice preference regarding risk and uncertain outcomes inverts when moving between gain and loss domains, and that certain gains are more highly prized and uncertain losses are more highly prized. And I agree. In the loss domain in particular, this is almost entirely because of a specific consequence of loss aversion, the desire to avoid losses whenever possible. Because if you have a chance of a loss versus a certain loss, the chance of loss will appear preferable when you're making that choice. So the question that emerges from this is why? Why do we think this way? This clearly is not any sort of precise linear model. It does not obey any rigorous quantification or pricing standards. Where does this come from? Well, and the answer, as is the case of all decision-making tools, is it comes from evolution. It comes from the way that our brains are built. We have loss aversion because it is an evolutionary imperative to do so. I know that I talk about this a great deal. I think, again, this is something that I mention at least in passing in virtually every episode that we've recorded to date. But I do so because it's really important. We have to keep in mind the context in which we developed these decision-making tools. We did not develop them to precisely position ourselves against a potential 20% dip in share value on an 18-month horizon. We developed these decision-making tools to keep us alive long enough that we can make babies. That's what we have these decision-making tools for, to survive and to reproduce. And loss aversion actually is very, very good for those purposes. If we think about that survival context and the environment in which we existed when this was really at the top of our day-to-day concerns, any potential loss could be fatal. Any potential loss could mean you're not around tomorrow. And so within this context, avoiding losses, even at the expense of pursuing gains, really does make sense. You never want to open yourself up to something that could be potentially life ending. And this is a big part of why I don't like conversations around rationality and irrationality. You'll oftentimes hear loss aversion referred to as irrational decision making. And I don't like this. I don't think this is accurate because within the context that loss aversion emerged, it's perfectly sensible. Not only that, it's quite predictable, I would argue. If you know what the shape of a particular prospect or outcome is, predicting and modeling people's loss aversion is really not that sophisticated. And these decision-making tools, loss aversion in particular, emerges from our dopamine neurons in the midbrain. This is important not just because I want to flex what I know about neuroscience. This actually has important functional consequences for us. Because this is dopamine driven, and because this occurs in the midbrain, not in the cortex, not in an evolutionarily modern part of the brain, it is not possible to get rid of loss aversion. These are deeply entrenched decision-making circuits that we have. We have no conscious processing or conscious oversight over them. And no matter what we do, we are stuck experiencing loss aversion. Now, we can train ourselves to recognize this. We can coach ourselves to not act immediately upon it, but we cannot, it is not possible to not experience loss aversion. If somebody sells you a particular program where they claim that they can train it out of you, they can train it out of your decision makers and your forecasters, and I have actually seen this advertised, these individuals are at best mistaken or at worst lying. And it's important that we are all aware this is something that we're stuck with. And given that we're stuck with it, I think it's really important to understand how do we deal with it? How do we mitigate it? And where is this really likely to impact and potentially contaminate the decisions that we have to make in risk management and in just human decision making in general?
Yeah, those are all great points, John. So I do want to speak in particular to your last point about loss aversion being something that is part of the human condition. I think that's really vital for our listeners to comprehend and to accept. You've had loss aversion since you can remember. When you got attached to your pacifier as an infant and it was taken away from you or you misplaced it, you felt a sense of loss. That hasn't changed. When today, perhaps your job even just changed a little bit from the way it was before, or maybe you had a responsibility taken away from you that you had become accustomed to having as part of your daily routine, you feel a sense of loss. There is nothing to quote unquote fix. What we are advocating here is to build an awareness of it and to be able to deal with situations where perhaps it is getting in the way of making more well thought out decisions. That's really what we're here to try to do today. Of course, we have discussed loss aversion in various different contexts, whether we're talking about loss of life from trains hitting people, or we're talking about organizations that feel a sense of loss if they don't acquire a business that they have become prospectively endowed to own. It comes up everywhere. It's about building that awareness and about knowing when loss aversion is overly coloring in a non-productive way how one is approaching a given decision. And in particular, I do want to touch a little bit on some of the risk management aspects of it and where ERM is going, what the vision of it is in pretty much every framework you look at nowadays. So getting back to the whole idea of loss aversion was really the impetus for the development of risk management, even on very informal bases, going back hundreds, if not thousands of years, back to the beginning of civilization. It was all about protecting in some way, shape, or form from some type of loss of something valued by one or more individuals. That has been the case since the ancient Greeks, Egyptians, so forth. You can go back and find examples of that throughout history. What modern ERM is about today is trying to go beyond loss aversion. And one of the big challenges, of course, then is, well, then how do I even think about the term risk? And that gets into something that you and I, John, faced and had to struggle through with regards to writing our textbook, which is how do we define risk?
I think
And
it's worth pointing out to our listeners that even today, you and I don't precisely agree on what risk is. And I think that illustrates how thorny a question this is, where two people, both reasonably well educated, who have been working together with a great deal of synergy for a number of years, really can't agree on something that is probably fundamental to the entire domain.
I would argue it's not just you and me, John, it's the human species, and that you can look up in a number of different places a definition of risk and get a different perspective. And I'll just read for our listeners how Webster defines it, since I thought I'd go to the source The primary source that I think most people tend to go to nowadays, the name Webster invokes authority bias. So I thought I would leverage authority bias for our audience. The definition of the word risk, just to be very precise here, which I think is considered pretty colloquial, is the possibility of loss or injury.
I think this goes very well with the definition that I used when I was putting together my lecture slides back in 2019. I went to arguably an even more authoritative source, Oxford. And
Excuse me.
in 2019, Oxford defined risk as a chance of loss or harm. Now, I think it's really interesting that while the precise verbiage is slightly different, they're basically saying the exact same thing.
They are. And that is when I talk to people about what I do, that is the viewpoint that they take. So that begs the question, what's the problem? And telling this to our audience from a 30 plus year actuarial career, I'm just going to give you this perspective, which is if you are looking at things in terms of any type of loss or injury, that is a very narrow way to think about things in terms of potential outcomes that can occur to either an individual or to an organization. And what do I mean by that? Well, what that then limits you to in terms of where you are looking at things is okay, here's my status quo today. I just don't want to be perceiving things as any worse than that tomorrow. In terms of some type of material loss or some type of reputational loss, all these types of things are things that I'm protecting against. Certainly fairly broad, but not within the gamut of all the possibilities that can happen. So I'll just give you one subtle example of where that definition would not apply, which is you have aspirations of growing your business 10% in a given time period. Let's call it 12 months. And let's say that you grow the business 5%. You've still gained, you haven't lost anything. Based on Webster and Oxford, you've lost nothing. You've actually gained from where you were. However, I would argue, and many business executives would argue, yeah, there's a loss there. There's a loss relative to where you plan to be. There's a loss based on expectations that is not factored into the Webster or Oxford definition.
And to that example, I think it's very clear that behavioral economics and behavioral neuroscience show that the brain would absolutely interpret that particular scenario that you just put forward, where your business grows by 5% against an expectation of growing 10% as a loss due to the endowment effect. This is something that we've talked about in passing. We probably should do an entire focused episode on endowment. But when you treat an outcome as though it has already happened, then any deviation from that, especially a deviation under, is processed as a loss, even if it is a net gain.
So that brings us to what does this mean for risk management departments and an enterprise risk management program? And what that means is that programs have to be more strategic and more embedded into processes that traditionally in organizations haven't been seen as the domain of risk management.
We were having a conversation with one of our research team earlier this week, and this topic came up. And it's something that I've thought for a very long time, but this is the first time that we've really had a reason to bring it to the forefront of conversation in any of the work that we've done. To the point that you've made around, for example, the individual whose business grows 5% against a 10% expectation, you can make a case that a more useful definition of loss aversion, or let's call it an operational or outcome-based definition, would be an inability to make useful plans. And in this case, this touches on something that we were discussing earlier, which is risk management to a very large extent can be seen as a specific application of forecasting, of making predictions about what is potentially likely to happen that is important or salient to our interests and operations and position ourselves appropriately. And if we can't make useful plans, then we can't do risk management.
That's true. And a modern definition, and a definition that we teach at Columbia, and the way you could redefine risk management is being able to do dynamic strategic planning, that you are able to have strategic plans that are truly representative of where your business is going and reflect the potential space of possibilities where your business can grow, and allowing you as a management team to be able to make decisions to maximize the likelihood of achieving the best possible outcomes for the said business.
I want to kind of jump on that before you go too much further with it, because I think I know where you're going with this. And I think that there are a few things that are going to converge on this. I mentioned that you and I don't have precisely the same internal definitions of risk. I have always liked to use the very broad description of risk as anything that might happen. I know you have problems with that, and I can't even say your reservations about it are wrong. But from a cognitive processing standpoint, I like the definition of risk as anything that might happen. Now, this layers onto your strategic planning comment in a very interesting way because it implies something that the traditional definitions of risk, the Webster and the Oxford definitions, don't capture. And that is risk can include positive things, risk can include good things. And the reason I'm harping on this is because loss aversion tends to make us forget about this, tends to make us ignore that, and means that our strategic planning gets highly contaminated. Would you agree with this? Am I dragging this in the wrong direction?
No, you're dragging this in the perfect direction, which is what I've seen in my career tends to happen with management teams in developing strategic plans. Now, what I'm about to say, and I'm going to put a few caveats on it, because sometimes these things are layered into elements such as compensation, which has certain endowment effects and so forth. But the tendency with management teams, particularly in established organizations, is to create strategic plans that follow what I like to call the bunny hop effect, which is we want to create a strategic plan which is effectively the challenge of doing a little bunny hop. So you need to put some work into it. You need to do some management, but if you largely do what you've been doing, you should be able to achieve said plan. And that ties back to not wanting to feel any sense of loss. And part of it from and I'll just tell you from the management perspective, is you need to keep your employees incentivized. And if their incentive compensation in some way, shape, or form is tied to achieving planned goals, and said goals are seen to be too difficult to achieve, that can be a demotivating factor. Whereas if it's seen as highly likely that they'll be met, you're more likely to keep some people on board, especially if the incentive compensation is substantial. So there is that dynamic that goes on and so forth that needs to be brought into play. But at the end of the day, strategic planning tends to be something that loss aversion acts almost like a weight, acts like gravity in terms of bringing down the aspirations. And that's where good governance, and that's where some pushback from a compensation committee of the board of directors can be effective. And again, the challenge is for organizations to find that right balance.
I see loss aversion in strategic planning across really every domain. We have a client right now. I'm not going to name names. I'm not even going to name the sector. I'll simply say that this client is a retail giant, a true global giant in the retail space. And all of the major strategic initiatives over the last 3 years that we've been working with them have been focused heavily on how do we minimize bleed to our competitors.
Hmm.
There's been virtually nothing coming down the pipeline about How do we leverage what we're good at to grow ourselves? And this is pure loss aversion. The ceiling is orders of magnitude higher if they were to focus on how do we do what we're already really good at, as opposed to how do we make sure we don't lose more traction to these competitors who are going to exist no matter what we do. So we see that loss aversion is something that really can be pernicious throughout all of strategic planning for organizations. And it can have a very profound consequence of ignoring opportunities, excessive focus on losses and downside, neglecting what you and I would call upside risk. And I know a lot of people find that term to be very odd, but I think it is useful and important. Neglect of upside risk leads to missed opportunities.
It leads to missed opportunities, and I would go a little further in that, particularly when evaluating opportunities, it can lead to disparate views about such opportunities. Because if you're getting all of your downside discussion from one set of people, and you're getting all of your upside information from another set of people, if you have people in different silos giving you these different perspectives, you may not be getting the most accurate reflection of what the possibilities are.
I would argue that it doesn't even have to be people in different silos, that we can see skewed or inaccurate representations even coming from one batch of people or even a single individual, purely because humans experience loss aversion. And what I mean by this is that very few organizational outcomes are entirely gains or entirely losses. There's a balance of both. This goes back to fundamental laws of economics. People face trade-offs. Any sort of normal business deal involves parting with something in order to get something. This is obviously a bit of a simplification. Usually there's a lot more complexity than just that. But at its core, that's what business transactions are, whether it be me going to the store and putting gas in my car or a Fortune 50 company acquiring another one. We give something and we get something back. And in general, in order for either a person or an organization to pull the trigger on a transaction like that, we have to feel that what we're getting in return for what we spend is worth the loss. It has to be sufficiently valuable or have sufficient upside that we are comfortable making the expenditure that we have to in order to acquire it. And obviously, loss aversion is going to contaminate this. And I would argue probably in most cases, unless somebody is doing a pure mathematical spreadsheet comparison of cost versus realistic expected upside, the acceptable expenditure is going to be probably lower than what it should be given a potential opportunity because of loss aversion.
I think even when there is a spreadsheet involved, John, sometimes that level of expenditure is unreasonable because individuals do want certain gains. So this is where it ties into risk aversion, that they want to know that their investment is going to provide some type of guarantee that they perceive as appropriate compensation. And I remember from my days working in the investment department that one of the key things in terms of doing good risk management is doing that type of risk return trade-off. And from the asset manager's point of view, being appropriately compensated for risk. That, yes, I know there's a downside here and my loss aversion does not like it, but if you pay me enough, I'll do it. But you've got to hit my target. And because of loss aversion, that often drives that number, that compensation number, to be somewhat high in order to maximize the possibility that you do get that return.
It's funny that you bring that up. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine just the other day. His company was under assessment for potential acquisition by a very large organization. And it hasn't fully played out yet, but it looks like the acquisition is going to fall apart because they simply can't meet his target. And in his words, unless they're bringing 8 to 9 figures to the table, it's not worth it for him to take on this exposure. Now, that's a huge figure. That's a huge amount for a very respectable business. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but that's a very, very large number.
Yeah, and again, this gets to what we've talked about, the phenomena and what the research shows in mergers and acquisitions, in that there is a seller endowment that comes into play here. So very often there's overpaying. We've talked about this in the deal lust episode, so I don't want to go too far down a field here and be repetitive for our audience. But sellers are only going to sell when you really wow them. When it's like, okay, I love this, I'm attached to it, we've built this, it's working, but yeah, I'm willing to let it go now. And that puts buyers in a situation where they've really got to almost thread a needle in many cases in order to make transactions work.
And this presupposes, of course, then the buyers themselves are being, I know I said I didn't like this term, are being rational and not themselves subject to loss aversion around the cost of an acquisition.
Well, I think that gets into now one of the things I wanted to ask you about. So there are a few conflicting things, and I'll just say from my relatively amateur neuroscience understanding that I wanted to just probe with you a little bit more, since you've been studying neuroscience for many more years than I have. And one of them is how loss aversion ties in with optimism and overconfidence, which seems to conflict, right? If you think about it on the surface, yes, we are loss averse, but at the same time, we've been telling our audience that we have a tendency towards optimism, that when we forecast a potential future, that we have a tendency to move towards the optimistic forecast, and that motivates us in some way, shape, or form to move forward. Can you address that?
Sure. This actually is one of those cases where it superficially looks like there's a contradiction and it's definitely a head scratcher. But when you dig in, even just a little bit, there's not really any conflict at all. And this is because we are in one of those domains where we're erroneously conflating two concepts that seem like they should be related, but aren't really. Optimism is almost entirely about probability of outcomes. How likely is something to occur favorably or unfavorably? Whereas loss aversion is about magnitudes of outcomes, gains or
Hmm.
losses. And this is what we opened up the conversation with, or one of the things we opened up our entire episode with, which is that loss aversion is not the same thing as risk aversion. And so they don't really conflict at all because optimism is much more about how do you evaluate the probabilities of something turning out positively. And with optimism, of course, we tend to overestimate the likelihood of positive outcomes. We tend to overestimate the likelihood of things turning out well for ourselves than historical information or our own experience would suggest. Whereas loss aversion is, let's say we can have an overconfident evaluation of an outcome, of the likelihood of an outcome, and still be subject to loss aversion when trying to decide how much are we willing to spend in order to make this outcome happen. Does that make sense?
That makes sense because of two reasons. One is that going back to what loss aversion is really about is we don't want to let go of anything. And it gets back to what I mentioned earlier about my former colleagues in the trade room telling me, yeah, we're willing to take something on, but you got to pay us for it. Right. So it gets back to how much is one willing to give up? How much is one willing to lose now for sure for the potential of a future gain? So you have very well structured this into a loss domain issue, which occurs initially from a buyer standpoint versus the gain standpoint, where optimism can often maybe conflate one's decision making.
They absolutely can interact. And I think a lot of the M&A deals we've looked at in the past, we could point to as instances where we see both of these phenomena in action, wherein you could have an organization looking at an acquisition where they believe that there is future value. They believe that by acquiring or merging with a particular entity, they will have a possibility for, let's call it a 10x return on their investment. And they have to, of course, assess the probability. How likely is it that we will actually get a 10x return? Now, as we've seen in many cases, the likelihood of a 10x return, often the likelihood of a 2x return, is often dramatically overestimated. This is a lot of overconfidence bias. I'm thinking of a few different cases. I know you probably are thinking of the same ones right now. But then, based on this evaluation of how likely a particular return is, we then have to figure out, all right, what's our price? We don't want to part ways with money. We don't want to part ways with anything. It might not be money. It might be spinning off a division or handing over a number of preferred shares, or there are any number of ways an organization may go about executing an acquisition or a merger. And pricing that internally, whether it be their opening offer or the final signing price, is heavily influenced by their own loss aversion.
Absolutely. The second point I wanted to touch on here, being an actuary or a recovering actuary in my case, is the way you have framed this whole loss aversion versus optimism, and one being more connected to probabilities of success versus how much do I lose to take on those probabilities, take on that potential set of outcomes, gets back to the old frequency versus severity problem, which is very near and dear. So for all the actuaries listening out there, this should be very near and dear to your heart, that these two things are separated just as, but yet connected from a behavioral standpoint, just as they are mathematically connected yet separate when you're evaluating them.
It's always amusing to me when, in a mathematical sense, high frequency outcomes are much more preferable because you can just model them much more accurately. But good luck telling that to a regulator or to a customer that we prefer high frequency events.
That's true. But that's because they're worried about just the overall cost or the overall losses involved. So everything comes back to a particular stakeholder's perspective, right? So all these things have to be balanced in order to make transactions work, not only in the moment, but to make them lasting successes. Where I wanted to go next, John, in
Mhm.
terms of connecting this back to other behavioral aspects of the human domain, is loss aversion is a very powerful driver. And it's something that is even different from many of the quote unquote cognitive biases or
Oh, yeah.
heuristics that we talk about.
It's more appropriate to call it a heuristic than a bias, I would say.
And I think even we've categorized it as a behavioral force, almost like
Yeah,
fundamental to being human, that it's not even necessarily a quote unquote heuristic. It's just we do it.
that's correct. Yes. It's a natural consequence of prospect theory, the asymmetry between the gain and the loss domains,
Yeah.
which itself is a natural consequence of dopaminergic activation in the brain.
Where we've discussed its ranking, quote unquote, in the behavioral force world is that it's actually below inertia, not quite as powerful as inertia, but almost as powerful. And also that it is different from inertia. So, what I wanted to ask you as I was thinking about this topic is there in some way a connection to inertia? And just hear me out before you disagree with me completely. But isn't part of loss aversion the fact that there's a comfort with the way things are because I survived to this moment? And if I have to give up something, then I might not survive. So isn't that in some way connected to this whole status quo, keeping things as steady as they go? Is there some connection, or am I just, again, showing my amateurishness in this field?
No, I think that's actually a pretty astute observation. First of all, let's be very clear that the rubric that you're referring to that we put forward in the book is exactly that. It is a rubric. It is not natural law. It's drawn as best we can from our understanding of natural laws, but there are judgment calls that have to be made, and there are going to be edge cases and corner cases that don't align precisely. That being said, I don't think what you're getting at is an edge case. I think it is a very nuanced understanding of something. And what you're getting at, I think, speaks far more to the challenges around coming up with a precise and consistent and broad definition of inertia. Because
Mm.
inertia actually has lots of different things that can drive it that come from different regions of the brain, that come from different behavioral factors. And what you've observed, that this drive for homeostasis is how we would describe it in biological terms, absolutely does have elements of inertia to it. The reason that I've separated it in this rubric is because loss aversion is something that is very specific and doesn't just apply to inertia. It applies to many other domains where loss aversion itself is a discrete force that is not related to inertia in certain contexts. Whereas inertia, loss aversion can feed into it, but many other things can feed into inertia as well. Habit, automated processes, lack of mental resources. All of these things can feed into loss aversion, as you pointed out. So, great call out. That is not in any way an amateurish read. That's actually a very astute read of what we've put forward.
Thank you for clarifying that. And that really does help me. And it helps me in terms of understanding a little bit more of the framework, the rubric, as you've referred to it as, which in the future I will take into account in my teaching, because I always want to get some of these subtle points, these nuanced points across the students a little bit better, because they do really take to it. And in some cases, I've had a number of students who really try to apply the rubric to everything they see. And I think it's great, but I also find myself a little bit like, yeah, you're coming to me with this interpretation. I'm not 100% sure about it. So thank you for that clarification.
I've encountered the same thing in the semesters that I've taught. And it's interesting because in attempting to teach a class on heuristics and biases, that organizational framework of behavioral forces is a heuristic. It's a shortcut for interpreting what particular behavioral forces are present when you have to make a comparatively quick evaluation and not perform a graduate thesis on what the behavioral architecture and choice architecture around a business decision is. So there are absolutely going to be cases where it doesn't map precisely, but it's a good enough model for figuring out quickly what's at play here and where should we be directing our attention.
So one last one for you, just to throw another fly in the ointment. I was thinking about a couple of the other behavioral forces that are in the rubric, in particular, the ones involving some form of reinforcing,
Mm-hmm.
which are reinforcement and punishment, which I kind of see as not exactly the same. But they're sort of two sides of the same coin, is the way I've thought about those two, although there are some unique differences between them. Uh,
That's
which
fair. Yeah.
which I won't go into, which obviously we're not going to go into today because it'll take another 2 hours. But I was thinking about loss aversion in the context of both of those. Can it be said that loss aversion is often leveraged within those particular constructs?
I would argue that it's even more fundamental than that. I would argue that loss aversion is defined by the asymmetry between reinforcement and punishment.
Wow. I don't think we've ever talked about this
We've
before.
not, I don't think so.
That's great.
But all of these forces are mediated through the dopaminergic pathways. This probably warrants its own episode someday. I'm going to try really hard not to go too deep into the weeds here. And for those of you who do have a neuroscience background, some of the simplifications I'm about to offer are going to make you scream and pull your hair out. I'm aware of this. Feel free to email me. Just be aware I recognize what I am saying as I'm putting this out there. All three of these forces, loss aversion, reinforcement, and punishment, occur through dopaminergic pathways. This is a fancy way of saying they happen because of what dopamine neurons do. Dopamine neurons are always active to some level. If you don't have active dopamine neurons, you have Parkinson's disease. You have severe Parkinson's disease. This is its own conversation, but it means that we always have a base level of dopamine activity. When dopamine activity goes up, we get reinforcement. When dopamine activity goes down, we get punishment. This maps basically one to one to the prospect theory curve because of various physiological and physics reasons, there actually is a limited range of dopamine activity that is even possible. Dopamine activity is modulated by what we call the activity frequency or firing frequency of these neurons. We have that base firing frequency, and then when something positive happens, the firing frequency goes up. When something negative happens, the firing frequency goes down. Well, you can't have firing frequency of less than zero. There's no such thing as a negative activity of neurons. And because of things like the maximum physical density of ion channels and membrane conductance, there is an upward limit on how fast neurons can activate. This means that we have a fixed range of punishment and reinforcement that it is physiologically possible to experience. This maps one-to-one onto the prospect theory curve. This is the physiological basis for prospect theory. It's worth pointing out that prospect theory and dopamine theory were not co-developed. They were independently developed in completely different laboratories. And it took a really long time for people to realize, hey, wait, these describe the same things. But where I'm going with this, we know that because of if we look at the prospect theory curve and the fact that we have this steeper loss domain, that lack of symmetry means that losses are felt more profoundly than gains. This occurs because of the relative contributions, the relative activity of dopamine neurons when we are in reinforcing and punishing modes. And so loss aversion is directly a consequence of the base function of reinforcement and punishment.
That's fascinating. I just got a picture of a curve of dopamine, which, okay, it can't obviously be lower than zero. You have to have some non-negative amount of dopamine in your system. And if I'm hearing you right, John, there is this baseline level, just as we talk about like baseline strategic plans. We have a baseline level of dopamine,
Your 0 point.
your quote unquote 0 point,
Mm-hmm.
and that there's like a gravitational pull. Loss aversion is effectively the gravitational pull of dopamine towards a suboptimal level or sub-baseline level of dopamine. So
I
yes,
would say it's the gravitational pull away from the suboptimal level of dopamine. It's the imperative to reestablish homeostasis
I
when
see.
your dopamine drops below baseline levels.
Because we don't want to feel that.
Biochemically, a depleted dopamine level is equivalent to cocaine withdrawal. It may be of a different amplitude, but that's what dopamine depletion is. And so when we are in a dopamine depleted state, we don't want to be in that state.
I
So loss
see.
aversion can be very well characterized as a desire to restore deficient dopamine.
That's powerful. That's really powerful knowledge, I think, for our listeners to know that. And then I'm just going to go a little bit further here, and I'm sure you're going to help me out here with this, which is that when we get those dopamine hits above our baseline level, they feel nice and we like it, but we don't hold on to it quite as much, right? We're not overly driven to stay at that level. I mean, we'd like to stay at that level, but it's not quite as powerful as the desire to get back to that baseline level when we fall below it. Is that a way to think about it?
That's broadly correct. There's a lot of nuance there going into the biochemistry,
Yeah.
which honestly I think is probably not worth purposes of this particular podcast. I would say that's broadly correct. One of the subtle but very consequential differences is when we look at naturally occurring modulation of dopamine, when we look at spikes and decreases in dopamine levels. Spikes tend to be more transient, they tend to be shorter, whereas dips tend to be longer lasting.
Yeah. I got it. I got it. Interesting.
This has all manner of implications in terms of mechanisms of learning and making predictions and updating predictions. As I said, we probably could do an entire episode around dopamine processes in risk management, but let's not go too deep down that rabbit hole today.
Yeah, and I think I've taken us there to an extent, maybe more than some of our risk management practitioners will appreciate. But hopefully, you'll be getting something from this that you can think about. Because as I see it, This has direct application in terms of ERM, in terms of the processes that you're building in your organizations, and how we can leverage this information to improve the overall decision-making process. And that is essentially that our brains are wired to guard against losses, and that's the first alert. And therefore, a lot of risk management departments, by its nature, the emphasis is going to be on protection, whatever that means to a particular organization. That's always going to be first. And I know from my experience in the program we ran at Assurant a number of years ago, that when we sat down with people in the organization, it was always about first, what keeps you awake at night, which is code for, okay, this is what I'm afraid of losing. This is my big loss aversion that I'm worried about. And only then, after that's been satisfied to a certain degree, can there be any type of discussion about opportunities or possible upside. But it takes effort to get to that place. There's almost a feeling of, from my experience anyway, that once you get through contemplating the loss aversion, that you're done. Because it's like, okay, I'm doing the things I need to do to avoid that hit, to avoid that dip in the dopamine level. And to get that view of, okay, let's see how you can feel better, takes a little bit of effort, takes a little bit going beyond where risk management just colloquially and from its history tends to go. So I think just the nature of the brain leads us to that more narrow definition of risk that we talked about, I guess, almost an hour ago in this podcast. But nevertheless, as we've emphasized, there is real opportunity to build upon that, to start to see the other side of dopamine and going beyond a baseline state through looking at opportunities, which ultimately is where organizations want to go. And that's how they thrive. And that's how they continue to succeed. Because, in my opinion, if an organization is not looking for those opportunities, is not looking for those upside dopamine adjustments, it will ultimately experience that dopamine hit and suffer the losses that no one wants to experience.
One of the things that you and I both tell our students every semester is that heuristics, biases, and cognitive forces never occur in isolation. There's never just one that is at play. One of the forces that interacts, I don't want to say perniciously because it's not intrinsically bad, but in terms of organizational risk management practice, does create some problematic decision making, is intertemporal discounting, looking at time domains. There is a very reasonable predisposition of risk managers and even executives to ask, well, what's so wrong with just being protective? What's wrong with being defensive and making sure we don't have risk exposure? If we're around tomorrow, if we're safe in the next 6 months, why is that a bad thing? The answer, of course, to this is that then the organization starts to stagnate. And okay, I've heard the counter argument to this. That's just a word. That's just a label for an operating mode. There's nothing intrinsically problematic about stagnation. And I suppose there may be very limited cases where that's true. But if we consider, coming back to more behavioral concepts here, if we consider the total competitive behavioral landscape in which your organization operates, there's going to be economic inflation, usually. There's going to be competitors emerging. There's going to be competitors shifting. There's going to be non-competitors who take on elements of your own market and domain. Stagnation is loss. Because of the time domain, we don't perceive it as such. We perceive it as a fixed or even potentially a benevolent future. But stagnation is its own domain of loss. Excessive loss aversion leading to stagnation creates its own version of loss, which, if you've been neglecting opportunities, is very, very hard to reposition from.
Wow, that is really well said, John. I've always felt that intuitively, and I think it's not only true for organizations, I think it's true for people's lives and careers in particular. I tell my students all the time, Continue to be curious. Bring that intellectual drive every day. Be open to the possibilities. Because if you're not open to the possibilities, you'll quickly start to feel like you're hemmed in and are limited by nature. And the truth is, we all have great potential, and in many cases, potential that's often untapped that we don't even realize.